Hello viewers, welcome to yet another class in Literature in English. Today we are going to extensively look at the majority, if not all, of the general literary terms and terminologies of which are associated with the subject of literature. Now, when we talk about general literary terms, we are referring to those terms or names that are peculiar to the parlance of literature. So we are going to be beginning this series and we are going to explain them as they will be projected. The first literary term we are going to look at is foreshadowing. This is a literary device in which a writer gives an advance hint of what is to come later in the story. Foreshadowing often appears at the beginning of a story or a chapter, and it helps the reader to develop expectations about the outcome of the story. When foreshadowing is employed, the poet, perhaps the playwright or even the novelist, is targeting a major aim, which is to reduce the tension of members of the audience so that they won't be too tense as a result of the expectations of the outcome of the play. So foreshadowing simply is an aspect at the beginning of a chapter of a work which forecasts or predicts the outcome of a work in order to give the readers or the audience an idea of what may likely be to come in the work of art. The next literary term is suspense. Of course, suspense is the anticipation of the outcome of a plot or the solution to an uncertainty, puzzle, or mystery, particularly as it affects a character for whom one has sympathy. Now, suspense is strongly a feature of tragedy. Now, the feeling of which members of the audience, me and you, of which conclusively, will always have as a form of an expectation of the outcome of a literary work is what you call suspense. You will always agree with me that suspense may not actually be part and parcel of comedies, or in some parlance, or you can bring it to farce. But as far as tragedy and tragicomedies are concerned, members of the audience will always have this feeling of uneasiness and tension of which is associated with a literary work. So the outcome of a literary work, the expectation of the product of a work of which members of the audience will always feel is what you call suspense. The next literary term is epitaph. Now, an epitaph is an inscription on a tombstone or a short verse which serves a major purpose of being reminded of something or a person which had died. Of course, we all must have had a glance on a tombstone before. That inscription on a tombstone is attributed to literature, of which it is termed as epitaph. So that inscription, perhaps most popularly, will be in loving memory of our beloved father who passed on to glory on a certain date and was buried on a certain date. May his soul rest in peace. That inscription is literary and it is termed an epitaph. Now, the next literary term I want you to know is pathos. Pathos is an appealing scene to the emotions of the audience which elicits emotional feelings from them. Now, when we talk about pathos, yet again, it is a strong feature of tragic plays as well as tragic comedies. It is that appealing scene to the emotions of the audience. Now, the difference between suspense and pathos is that whereas suspense is mostly attributed and general to all the scenes and acts in a tragic work, but pathos mostly is attributed to a particular act or scene. Perhaps all other acts or scenes may not be very relevant or may not evoke the feeling of emotions or pity or perhaps anger or whatsoever feeling it may be. This is particularly attributed to a certain scene of which we are talking about particularly. The next literary term we are going to look at is bathos. Bathos is an unintentional lapse of mood from the sublime or noble to the ridiculous or trivial. Now, what that definition of bathos means is that a statement that is containing this literary term will always be declining from the very apex, perhaps to the middle, and then we find it at the very nadir or base. For example, if I make a statement like, after the collapse of the building, the woman rescued her camera and then her plate, and then she also rescued her needle. Now, that is a typical example of Pathos, because you could see the sublime decline from the very important to the middle ground and then to the less important. When statements are made of which this decline is done, then you can say that such a statement is Pathos. The next literary term is comic relief. Comic relief is the inclusion of a humorous character, scene, or witty dialogue in an otherwise serious work, often to relieve tension. It is very important to note that the person who anchors a comic relief in a tragic play is known as a clown. Now, when we talk about comic relief, it is a scene, a person that is infused in the middle of a very literary work, serious literary work, I beg your pardon, in order to lapse the mood and relax the tension of members of the audience. When we talk about comic relief yet again, we are relating it strongly to a subgenre of literature, drama specifically, known as tragedy. You will never hear of comic relief as being a feature of comedy, even when the title is comic, but it is part and parcel of tragedy. The reason is, tragedy is a play that evokes serious action. It evokes the feelings of pity and fear in members of the audience. Therefore, in the midst of these high tensive events, a scene, a character may be introduced to act some comic incidents and scenes in order to calm the nerves and tensions of the audience. This scene or character is known as comic relief. Now, the next literary term is lampoon. This is a serious satirical attack on certain wrong things in the society or beyond. When we talk about lampooning, you can say that it is a work, a scene, or even a script that is satirizing, is criticizing the wrong things that are going on in a society. Therefore, you can say that a play is lampooning the corrupt practices of a certain society. So lampoon means to criticize, it means to mock, it means to laugh at, it means to expose the wrongs, the ills and the excesses of the wrong things that are going on in a particular society. This is very, very important in a satirical work of art, whose aim is always to lampoon, criticize, and even satirize the excesses of a person or a society. Now, the next literary term is humor. Humor is the quality of being amusing or comic, especially as expressed in literature or speech. When you say that a character is humorous, it simply means that such a character has the tendency to evoke the sense of laughter in the minds of the audience. When you say that a play is humorous, of course, you are also saying that it has the ability to cause the members of the audience to laugh. Humor is part and parcel of comedy and also farce. If you refer to Wole Soyinka's play titled The Trials of Brother Jero, as well as its sequel titled Jero's Metamorphosis, you will have no other option than to laugh, laugh, and laugh. Of course, which is what we refer to as humor. The next literary term is peripeteia. Peripeteia is a sudden and unexpected change of fortune or reverse of circumstance in the play. Also, it is called the turning point. Peripeteia is simply, again, a strong feature of tragedy. When we say that peripeteia is a scene, we are referring to that point in a tragic play of which things begin to go badly to the tragic hero. Now, do not forget that when a tragic play begins, the tragedy doesn't happen immediately. Perhaps when you look at the 5-act structure of a tragic play, you will agree with me that peripeteia will always come in the second and third scenes, where you see the tragic hero beginning to experience a reversal of fortune. Now, he is always beginning the play by exposing his traits, his strengths, and even most importantly, his calling. But towards a particular act or scene, these things begin to change. His downfall begins to be imminent. That period in a tragic play where you see the tragic hero begin to experience a reversal of fortune, of which will eventually lead to his downfall or death, is what you call peripeteia. The next literary term is allegory. This is a form of narrative in which the character and events symbolize an underlying moral or spiritual quality or represents a hidden meaning beneath the literary. When you say that a particular literary work or even a character in a literary work is allegorical, we are simply saying that those characters or work is indirectly representing some other thing which may be physical in appearance. So, therefore, we can always say that an allegorical concept will not be talking about the concept in appearance, but it will be representing another concept of which we will notice in the work of art. If we must say that George Orwell's The Animal Farm is allegorical, now in that work of art, a novel specifically, you will see animals acting the roles of men, talking. But these animals were representing some other people. They were talking about the concepts. If you have a very good knowledge about the issue of communism, you will declare a socialist republic in Germany. You will agree with me that these animals were representing those figures we saw in the development of that country. So, allegorical concepts usually represent something that is beneath the literary. If you also look at Tess Nwamio's The Desert Encroaches, you will agree again that you see concepts that are representing order beneath and order beneath concepts. As we will be analyzing literary works, we will clearly, of course, be looking at those concepts in the work. Now, the next literary term is an anthology. An anthology is a collection of short works in verse, particularly by various writers. The term also explains selected passages from longer works. When we say that a work of art is an anthology, we are simply talking about a collection of poems from different poets. Therefore, the person who compiles an anthology will be known as an editor. An editor. The person who compiles this is an editor. And then a very typical example of an anthology is a work compiled and edited by Donatus Ibe Nwoga, and it is titled West African Verse. In that work, West African Verse, you will see a lot of poems from different poets. The poems of Wole Soyinka, the poems of Christopher Okigbo, the poems of J.P. Clark, and a host of others are compiled in that work. That collection of literary work is what you call anthology. And do not forget, the person who compiles this work is also known as an editor. Another example of an anthology is also the one edited by Wole Soyinka, and is titled Poems for Black Africa. Now, having looked at that particular literary term, the next one we will consider is denouement. Of course, you heard me read it as denouement and not denouement. It's denouement. Now, this refers to the falling action of a story. This is that part of the plot after the climax, when problems faced by the characters begin to resolve. It is also known as the resolution. Now, in the order of a play, you know that the first stage is the reception or the introduction. The next stage is the conflict or the rising action. The next is the climax or the falling action. And then the last stage is the denouement or the resolution. So that stage in a work of art, when all the conflicts in the play have finally been resolved, the mole has been spotted, the conflict has been resolved, the issues of problems have been found out, and then every character has been settled. That stage in a work of art is known as the denouement or the resolution. The next literary work, or term rather, we are looking at is Bildungsroman. Bildungsroman is a novel which particularly describes the development of the central character from youth to maturity. When we talk about this type of novel, it focuses particularly on the growth, the development, and the expansion of the central character of a literary work or a literary work from infant level to maturity. That kind of novel is called a Bildungsroman. An example of this type of novel is Flora Wapper's novel titled One is Enough, of which you saw Amaka, the central character, developing from a small geographical area to a complex geographical area, from economic dependence to economic superiority. In fact, from inexperience, of course, yet again, to experience, from naivety to wealth of knowledge. All these are the focus of a novel that carries this term. Bildungsroman concentrates on the development of the particular central character. Now, the next literary term is canto. Canto is the literary term used to indicate the division of a long poem. You will agree with me if I say that canto is an advanced form of stanza. As far as a short poem is classified in stanzas and perhaps lines, a long narrative poem is classified in terms of canto. A typical example is a poem written by William Morris. It's titled The Proud King. The Proud King has 119 cantos, of which these long classifications could not be called stanzas because it is a very long narrative poem. Another example will be Beowulf. You will see it's quite long, so that classification of a long narrative poem is not stanzaic, but it is called canto. Another literary term is couplet. This is a pair of rhyme lines if verse of equal length. Also, it is termed the heroic couplet. You can call it couplet, you can also call it heroic couplet. When we say that the heroic couplet has been employed in a poem, we are simply saying that, as the name implies, couplet, which means two, every two lines of the poem keeps rhyming with each other. I can quote the first four lines of a very popular poem that uses this technique, and it is titled To His Coy Mistress and put forward by Andrew Marvell, and it says, Had we but world enough and time, this shyness, my lady, will be no crime. We will sit down and look at which long ways to go, even when we know that we have to relax and let low. You can see that as you read this poem going, you will see that every last word of the two lines at each keeps on rhyming, and that's what we call a heroic couplet. The next literary term is dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is a situation in which a character says or does something that has a meaning for the audience other than the obvious meaning that he or she does not understand. Of course, from the term irony, which means the opposite of the intended action, dramatic irony is a situation in drama in which the character stages an action which he may not know the real meaning of the action he does, but really will give the interpreted meaning by the members of the audience. Also, dramatic irony can be a situation in which two or more characters seem to relate with each other or one another without knowing the true identity of such characters. For example, a quick flash into Olarotim's play titled The Gods Are Not to Blame. You will agree with me that Odewale actually related with his father, not knowing that that man was indeed his biological father. We saw an altercation that came between the two of them, which led to Odewale killing his biological father and then crowned king eventually to marry his biological mother. All these relationships he was having was not occurring to him. He never knew clearly that the man he killed in the field was his father, and that the woman rather he is about to marry, of which he eventually did, is his biological mother. This situation in drama is termed dramatic irony. Only the members of the audience will know the truth. These characters will engage in an action without knowing the implications, the true implications of those actions, but members of the audience will showcase the true identity of such action. The next literary term is enjambment. Enjambment is a style in poetry in which the idea in a line of a poem runs onto the next line. It is also known as run-on lines. Run-on lines. If you don't call it enjambment, you can refer to it as run-on lines. When you say that run-on lines have been used in a poem, it simply means that the idea in a line of poetry has been run on to the next line. It does not finish. For example, if you want to make a sentence like, the boy is an intelligent person, that's an idea. But if you want to apply enjambment in that statement in a line of poetry, you can write the boy in the first line, and then the second line will carry is extremely intelligent. With that, you can see one idea being run on to the next line. That style, that term, or that technique in literature, specifically in poetry, is called run-on lines or enjambment. The next literary term is an epistolary novel. An epistolary novel is the form of a series of letters written to and from the main characters, and sometimes presented by the author in the anonymous role of an editor. When you talk about an epistolary, it is a type of prose, if you should classify it as such, that deals with letters used as a form of message and conversation between and among the major characters. And then we added there in that note that the person who projects these letters will be acting in the anonymous role as an editor. What this means clearly is that you seem not to be hearing the voice of the author. Neither will you hear any form of narrative technique in an epistolary writing. Rather, the readers of these type of work seem to be hearing directly from the main characters in the work. Now, a typical example of an epistolary is a novel put forward by Mariam Abar, and it is titled So Long a Later. In So Long a Later, we saw that the conversation that went around the major characters like Aishatu and Ramatulaye were all in forms of letters. This type of literary work is what you refer to as an epistolary novel. I will somewhat classify Denis Brutus's work titled Letters to Martha as an epistolary as well. Another literary term is a fable. A fable is that story that features animals who speak and act like human beings with the intent of conveying a moral lesson. Fables feature animals who act and talk and even perform like human beings, of which its major aim is to communicate a strong message. We will mention George Orwell's Animal Farm, as well as of which we've talked about The Days That Encroaches by Tess Wamo as one of an examples of a fable. Now, the next literary term is the foot. A foot is the basic unit of rhythm in poetry, composed of a fixed combination of stressed and unstressed or long and short syllables. When you say that foot is part and parcel of a poem, we are referring to that tone in which we will have one stressed and one unstressed syllable. Now, if I mention a word like coming, you will agree with me that coming there has two syllables. The first is come, and then the second is in, of which you will also agree that the first syllable is stressed and then the second one is unstressed. A combination of one stressed and unstressed syllable in poems is what you call foot. One stressed and one unstressed, of which we will eventually see things like the Iambic Pentameter as we progress in this lesson. Another example of a literary term is Gothic Novel. A Gothic novel is a type of novel which was extremely popular in the late 18th century, combining elements of the supernatural and the macabre. When we say that a novel is Gothic, we are simply saying that it contains a twin element of both human beings and sometimes very abstract or non-human creatures. Sometimes you can refer to those creatures as abstract. Sometimes you can say they are humans, but you will never say that they are human beings. They can be non-humans or abstract in nature. A very good example of a Gothic novel or expression is a work put forward by, or it's an historical poem titled Sir Gawain and the Grey Knight. In Sir Gawain and the Grey Knight, we saw clearly a mixture of humans as well as abstract objects and sometimes creatures of which will be acting the role and relating. And in some Gothic novels, you will see man engaging in a serious war with some unnamed creatures, of which we will eventually see the outcome. These novels are termed Gothic novels. Another example of a literary term we are looking at is an Iambic Foot. Iambic Foot. The classical verse foot, which consisted of a short syllable followed by a long syllable. Now, we've talked about foot having one stressed and one unstressed syllable. Now, Iambic Foot will always feature, again, one stressed and one unstressed syllable. So that when we talk about a term like Iambic Pentameter, we are looking at a line of poetry having one stressed and one unstressed in 5 places. Pentameter means 5. When we get to that level, we will give text examples and explain. So, an Iambic Foot means one stress and one unstressed in a line of poetry. Another example, an instance of a literary term, is Iambic Pentameter. Yet it comes. An Iambic Pentameter is a form of poetic rhythm that contains 5 long or stressed syllables and 5 short or unstressed syllables on a line of poetry. Yes, we've talked about foot, we've mentioned an Iambic Foot. Now it is an Iambic Pentameter. As we had said that an Iambic Foot must have one stressed and one unstressed syllable in a line, Iambic Pentameter therefore will have one stressed and one unstressed in 5 places. Now, the traceable example of a poem that has this style is the one written in 1920 by W.B. Yeats. It's titled The Second Coming. I will quote the first 4 lines of that poem for emphasis. It reads, "Turning and turning in the widening gear, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." If you had written that down, you will agree with me that each of those 4 lines which I have quoted in the first quatrain of that poem titled The Second Coming has 10 syllables. 5 of them are stressed, 5 of them are unstressed in each of the 4 lines of which is called a quatrain that I have quoted. When you say turning, that's stressed and unstressed, and turning, you will notice that this rhythm keeps falling up and down in every line of the first 4 lines of that quoted part, of which it is applicable in every line of that poem titled The Second Coming. Please find it for emphasis and you will understand exactly. Like I had mentioned, you will see that every line of that poem contains 10 syllables. 5 are stressed and 5 are unstressed. That line is called an Iambic Pentameter. So W.B. Yeats, his full name is William Butler Yeats, actually wrote the majority of his poems using this type of rhythm. The next literary term is stream of consciousness. The narrative technique in which characters voice their feelings, thoughts, and impressions directly without the authorial comment or orthodox dialogue. Now, when we had talked about prose in one of our lessons, we had said that the story in every prose text is always narrated from a perspective, a narrative angle, which we call the narrative style, or which other example. We had highlighted some illustrations or instances. Now, stream of consciousness is not a narrative technique because members of the audience or the readers seem to hear directly from the characters in this particular type of narration. If we talk about an epistolary writing being a type of novel, you will say and agree with me yet again that members of the audience or the readers seem to directly hear their thoughts, the thoughts of the actors and actresses directly from them. There is no person who talks on behalf of the other. This is what we call stream of consciousness. Therefore, stream of consciousness focuses on hearing the thoughts, the feelings, and the emotions of the characters directly from them, as opposed to the normal narrative style as it would be applicable in prose. Now, having looked at these literary terms, we have so far looked at the majority of them in the frame. Now, I want to conclude by saying that you should look out for our next video, as we will be looking at the concluding part of this lesson on general literary terms. Thank you.